Welcome to the Henry George Day Devotional, episode 39. We are in book 3, The Laws of Distribution, chapter 2, Rent and the Law of Rent. Productive. Alright. Um, we just learned Ricardo's law of rent. The rent of land is determined by the excess of its produce over that which the same application can secure from the least productive land in use. Alright. Let's get back to business. I was camping yesterday, so I missed a day. Sorry. Perhaps it may conduce to a fuller understanding of the law of rent to put it in this form. The ownership of a natural agent of production, excuse me, will give the power of appropriating so much of the wealth produced by the exertion of labor and capital upon it as exceeds the return which the same application of labor and capital could secure in the least productive occupation in which they freely engage. I hope that did get you a fuller understanding in that form. It seems like a very similar form. Yes, we're comparing the discrepancy between what labor and capital can secure, is the term he uses, um, in something that doesn't require paying for land. So either land that's just basically free that nobody cares about. Um, I guess that's the only option. So however much money, wealth, whatever, produce you can produce, production you can produce with labor and capital on free land. The difference between how much you can produce on free land versus what you can produce on a given piece of land, that difference is what you will gain. Howdy mate, you stream pretty cool, that's why I follow. Okay, we have spam in the chat. This, however, amounts to, back to George. This, however, amounts to precisely the same thing, for there is no occupation in which labor and capital can engage which does not require the use of land. And furthermore, the cultivation or other use of land will always be carried to as low a point of remuneration, all things considered, as is freely accepted in any other pursuit. Suppose, for instance, a community in which part of the labor and capital is devoted to agriculture and part to manufactures. The poorest land cultivated yields an average return which we will call 20, and 20 therefore will be the average return to labor and capital as well in manufactures as in agriculture. Suppose that some permanent cause Suppose that from some permanent cause the return in manufactures is now reduced to 15. Clearly the labor and capital engaged in manufactures will turn to agriculture, and the process will not stop until, either by the extension of cultivation to inferior lands, or to inferior points on the same land, or by an increase in the relative value of manufactured products, keep yawning, owing to the diminution of production, or, as a matter of fact, by both processes, the yield to labor and capital in both pursuits has, all things considered, been brought again to the same level. So that, whatever be the final point of productiveness at which manufactures are still carried on, whether it be 18 or 17 or 16, cultivation will also be extended to that point. And thus, to say that rent will be the excess in productiveness over the yield at the margin or lowest point of cultivation is the same thing as to say that it will be the excess of produce over what the same amount of labor and capital obtains in the least remunerative occupation. Yes. I'm not sure how unclear that is. He manages to say the same thing 3 times, and it still seems like he doesn't really change the format of it very much. Um, but this is a nice comparison that, if it was at 20 and then it drops to 15, then other land and other things will start to be utilized until they also drop. Well, they won't. Their value won't drop. They'll just go. Previously unused land will suddenly become used until the cheapest land is then worth 15. Because what you can do for free um, is going to be 15. So all the other land will, yeah. I probably just made it more confusing now. Oh well. The law of rent is, in fact, but a deduction from the law of competition, and amounts simply to the assertion that as wages and interest tend to a common level, all that part of the general production of wealth which exceeds what the labor and capital employed could have secured for themselves, if applied to the poorest natural agent in use, will go to land owners in the shape of rent. It rests in the last analysis upon the fundamental principle, which is to political economy what the attraction of gravitation is to physics, that men will seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion. This point gets brought up in discussions from time to time. Uh, and people argue about whether or not people are lazy or not, or are they just efficient? I don't know. But I do tend to agree that people will seek to do uh, what will satisfy them with the least exertion. Uh, because why would they exert more if they don't have to? Like, yeah. The only time I like to exert myself, seemingly more than I have to, is because I'm trying to get in shape or something. But then you would have to say I do have to exert myself a lot to do that. I would say the times when I exert myself greater than necessary to gratify my own desires is usually when I'm being foolish. Um, Maybe not foolish, or just simply dumb. This, then, is the law of rent. Although many standard treatises follow too much the example of Ricardo, which seems to view it merely in its relation to agriculture, and in several places to speak of manufactures yielding no rent, when in truth manufactures and exchange yield the highest rents, as is evinced by the greater value of land in manufacturing and commercial cities, thus hiding the full importance of the law, yet ever since the time of Ricardo, the law itself has been clearly apprehended and fully recognized, but not so its corollaries. Plain as they are, the accepted doctrine of wages, backed and fortified, not only has been hitherto explained, but by considerations whose enormous weight will be seen when the logical conclusion toward which we are tending is reached. These has hitherto prevented their recognition. What were we talking? Their corollaries have the recognition of the corollaries has been prevented. Everyone accepts the law of rent about why a piece of land goes for as much as it goes for, because you compare it to how much you could make off of the free land. So people are all cool with that, but everyone failed to understand its corollaries. This is Buckle 2, Chapter 11, History of Civilization. Recognizes the necessary relation between rent, interest, and wages, but evidently never worked it out. They didn't. They didn't. They didn't find its corollaries. We got to find them corollaries. George continues. Yet, is it not as plain as the simplest geometrical demonstration that the corollary of the law of rent is the law of wages, where the division of the produce is simply between rent and wages? Yes, the produce that has been created from land, labor, and capital Uh, the division is simply between rent and wages. Okay. That's where there's no capital involved. Then it just is yeah, if there's no capital involved and you just have land and labor, the produce is divided between rent and wages. Or the law of wages and interest taken together, where the division is into rent, wages, and interest. Stated reversely, the law of rent is necessarily the law of wages and interest taken together, for it is the assertion that no matter what the production which results from the application of labor and capital, these two factors will receive in wages and interest, respectively, only such part of the produce as they could have produced on land free to them without the payment of rent, that is, the least productive land or point in use. 4. If of the produce all over the amount of all over the amount which labor and capital could secure from land, for which no rent is paid, must go to landowners as rent, then all that can be claimed by labor and capital as wages and interest is the amount which they could have secured from land yielding no rent. Yeah, all right. If uh, if you had land that was didn't require that yielded no rent, it's basically free land. All of the produce would be claimed back by the labor, or if you utilized capital, that would get the interest. Yes. Or to put it in algebraic form, as produce is to rent, wages are to interest. Therefore, produce is to rent as wages is to interest. I don't know. If you're watching this, you can see that the notation has been botched by whatever format or whatever method was used to digitize this book. Um, yeah, I think this is produce equals rent, wages, and interest. Yes, because the return um, to labor is wages, return to interest is, I'm sorry, the return to capital is interest, the return to labor is wages, and the return to land is rent, and that is what the total produce is distributed with. Um, so I think this might be a subtraction sign. Produce minus rent. So if you subtract the rent from your produce, that has to equal, I think little a is the equal sign, wages, and the C is a plus, wages plus interest. Look, if you're watching here, you can see me digitally, we'll edit this. Produce equals rent plus wages plus interest. Produce minus rent equals wages plus interest. To get from here to here, we just subtracted rent from both sides. So we get rid of rent here, and we move it to the left side, and we subtract it from produce. That's kind of making us do our own work. It's kind of fun. All right. Mm, oh, we're gonna finish this little chappy chapter off. George continues. Thus, wages and interest do not depend upon the produce of labor and capital, but upon what is left after rent is taken out, or upon the produce which they could obtain without paying rent, that is, from the poorest land in use. And hence, no matter what be the increase in productive power, if the increase in rent keeps pace with it, neither wages nor interest can increase. In some sense, this is all of Georgism right here. That this relationship between land and produce and then wages is is what is entirely misunderstood when I have studied capitalism and what little I know of socialism, where they just sort of treat land as capital. But I'm not so sure socialism fully gets it fully wrong, but they just think that the solution should be to like centralize or socialize everything. Whereas George doesn't think we need to do that. He'll eventually tell us about his remedy, but we're not there yet. He has a lot more to say about this. The moment this simple relation is recognized, a flood of light streams in upon what was before inexplicable, and seemingly discordant facts range themselves under an obvious law. Maybe arrange themselves. The increase of rent, which goes on in progressive countries, is at once seen to be the key which explains why wages and interest fail to increase with increase of productive power. Hello, Suki LaPlante. For the wealth produced in every community is divided into two parts by what may be called the rent line, which is fixed by the margin of cultivation, or the return which labor and capital could obtain from such natural opportunities as are free to them without the payment of rent. Yes, the margin of cultivation is talking about again about that bit of land that is still useful and that you would be willing to pay ever so slight of an amount to use versus just the free land that nobody would even charge you for, that anyone can take advantage of. I'm not sure what you're trying to say there, Suki. Toke Baki Site, a song from my region. What's your region? Alright, I'll finish reading. From the part of the produce below this line, wages and interest must be paid. All that is above goes to the owners of the land. Thus, where the value of land is low, there may be a small production of wealth, and yet a high rate of wages and interest, as we see in new countries. And where the value of land is high, there may be a very large production of wealth, and yet a low rate of wages and interest, as we see in old countries. And where productive power increases, as it is increasing in all progressive countries, wages and interest will be affected, not by the increase, but by the manner in which rent is affected. If the value of land increases proportionately, all the increased production will be swallowed up by rent, and wages and interest will remain as before. If the value of land increases in greater ratio than productive power, rent will swallow up even more than the increase, and while the produce of labor and capital will be much larger, wages and interest will fall. It is only when the value of land fails to increase as rapidly as productive power that wages and interest can increase with the increase of productive power. All this is exemplified in actual fact. And that concludes chapter 2.